The Colosseum held 80,000 people on this afternoon in 180 AD. Every seat was filled. The air wasn't thick with tension. It was thick with the smell of sweat, sand, and iron down in the arena. A gladiator named Sceva was fighting for his life. He was a secutor, a pursuer weighed down by a heavy helmet and a rectangular shield. His opponent, a retiarius named Calendio, was all speed, armed with a trident and a net. The sand between them was stained a permanent dark brown. That patch had a name, the previous match. In the imperial box, shaded by a canopy of purple silk, sat the new emperor. Commodus was 19. He didn't watch the crowd. He watched the sand. He watched the way Sceva moved, not with grace but with a brutal, efficient economy. A misstep. Calendio's net flashed out, wrapping around Sceva's leg. The crowd roared as the gladiator fell. Commodus leaned forward, his eyes fixed not on the victor, but on the man in the dirt. Sceva raised a finger in the universal plea for mercy. The crowd thundered its judgment, thumbs down. Calendio's trident came down once. The roar peaked, then faded into a buzzing murmur. That's when Commodus turned, not to a senator or an advisor, to the man standing rigidly beside him, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, Prefect Tigidius Perennis. The emperor's voice was calm, conversational, cutting through the distant noise. "I could do that." Perennis laughed. It was a reflex, the sound a man makes when his young master makes a joke about the weather. The laugh was short, hollow, and died in his throat. Commodus was not smiling. He was studying the prefect's face, watching the realization dawn. That moment when you see someone doing something extraordinary and think, "I could do that," but you actually mean it. The emperor meant it. The prefect's smile vanished. Commodus turned back to the arena, where slaves were dragging Sceva's body through the gate of the dead. He had just seen a man killed for entertainment, and he had seen his future. Dawn at the Palatine Hill. Not the golden public dawn that gilded temples, but a gray, private light that seeped into the palace's innermost courtyard. This was the imperial training yard. The sand here was clean, raked fine, bordered by marble statues of gods and past emperors looking on with blank stone eyes. In the center, a single figure, Commodus. He wore a simple, sweat-darkened linen tunic, no purple, no gold. In his hands was a rudis, a heavy wooden practice sword. His opponent was a scarred oak post. He attacked it, not with the fluid skill he'd admired in Sceva, but with the raw, furious strength of a young man who had never been told no. Thwack. The wood shuddered. Thwack, a splinter flew. His breath came in ragged clouds in the cold air. His palms, soft from a lifetime of silk and scrolls, were already a ruin of blisters and raw, weeping flesh. Leaning against a statue of Mars, the god of war he was impersonating, stood his new trainer, Narcissus, a former champion from the sands of Alexandria, bought for a fortune and sworn to secrecy. He was a man carved from olive wood and old scars, his arms a map of healed-over bites from nets and tridents. He had not spoken for an hour. Commodus swung again, a wild overhead chop that left his side exposed. He grunted with the effort, the sound echoing off the enclosing walls. This was the first humbling day of trying to master something you've only ever watched. The gap between the idea and the body was a chasm. He was not an emperor here. He was a boy with a stick. Narcissus watched the emperor's feet. They were wrong. They were the planted, confident feet of a man who expected the world to move for him. In the arena, that was a death sentence. The trainer's silence was a weapon, more unnerving than any critique. It forced Commodus to hear his own clumsy violence, to feel the sting in his hands, to see the pitiless judgment in the stone eyes of his ancestors. Finally, after a swing so off-balance Commodus nearly fell, Narcissus pushed himself off the statue. His voice was low, gravelly, devoid of the sycophant's honey. It was the tone you'd use to correct a dog. Again. Commodus paused, chest-heaving, looking at the man as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. No one used that tone. Not here. Narcissus didn't blink. He pointed a thick finger at the emperor's feet in the sand. "Your footwork is a child's." The words hung in the dawn air, a challenge more dangerous than any gladiator's net. In that moment, two futures diverged, one where the emperor had his new toy executed for insolence, and another, darker path where he listened. Commodus wiped his bleeding palm on his tunic, looked at the post, and raised the wooden sword. He did not order the man's death. He swung again, and Narcissus, for the first time, allowed himself a thin, invisible slice of a smile. The lesson had begun. The corruption of absolute power was now a two-way street. 6 months later, the lesson had moved from the private yard to the beating heart of the trade. The Ludus Magnus, midday sun baked the central practice arena, a rectangle of coarse yellow sand encircled by a high wooden fence. The air was a solid thing, sweat, the tang of animal fat used to treat leather, and the sharp scent of linseed oil rubbed into practice weapons. This was not the curated silence of the palace. This was noise, the grunt of impacts, the scuff of sandals, the shouted curses of trainers, the rhythmic thud of wooden swords on straw-stuffed posts. Commodus stood across from a veteran Murmillo, a man named Brixus, whose body was a topography of old scars. The emperor wore a gladiator's subligaculum, a loincloth, and a padded leather chest guard. In his hand was a heavy wooden scutum shield and a rudis. He was no longer a boy with a stick. Narcissus had rebuilt him from the ground up, drilling the emperor's privileged feet into the balanced, sliding stance of a fighter. The corruption was mutual. The champion now wore a discreet gold band on his wrist, and the emperor's palms were maps of callus. Brixus came in low, his practice gladius a blur. Commodus caught it on the shield's rim. The impact jutted up his arm. He pushed back, trying a thrust Narcissus had drilled 100 times. Brixus, who had survived a dozen real fights in the provinces, slipped it with a subtle turn of his shoulder. He wasn't holding back. The gold in the world couldn't make a man take a killing blow, even a wooden one, for an amateur. His counterstrike was a short, brutal chop to the ribs. The crack was audible across the yard. Not bone, the laminated wood of the shield's edge splintered. The force drove the air from Commodus's lungs and sent him stumbling back into the hot sand. A gasp, not from him, but from the handful of other trainees who had paused to watch. The world narrowed to the taste of copper, the blinding sun, and the grit in his teeth. Silence fell over the ludus. The only sound was the emperor's ragged, wheezing attempt to draw breath. Brixus stood frozen, his practice sword half lowered, the reality of what he'd just done dawning behind his eyes. Narcissus, leaning on the fence, didn't move. This was the moment, the pivot. Every man in that yard knew the stories. The senators executed for a cough, the servants drowned for spilling wine. This was more than a cough. Commodus pushed himself up onto his elbows, then his knees. He spat into the sand, a bright, shocking ribbon of red. He looked at it, then at the shattered shield, then at Brixus. He smiled. It wasn't the gracious smile of a noble sportsman. It was the wide, genuine, terrifying grin of a man who had just found the only thing that felt real. The pain was a message, and he understood it. The other gladiators watched, not breathing, as the emperor of Rome got to his feet, discarded the broken shield, and gestured for another. The hobby was over. It had become an identity. He would now require opponents who did not fear him, because in that fear was the only truth he cared to feel. And Narcissus, from the shadows of the fence, understood the deeper game. He had created a monster that could now only be fed with real blood on real sand, The path to the Colosseum's gate was now inevitable. The path from the ludus to the Colosseum was shorter than anyone expected. 16 months after Brixus cracked his ribs, the emperor stood in the hypogeum, the labyrinthine underworld beneath the arena floor. The air here was different. Cold, damp stone, the smell of wet mortar, animal dung from the pens, and the iron oxide reek of the hydraulic lifts. It was 181 AD. Commodus was 21. He stood before a polished bronze mirror, not as an emperor, but as a secutor. The gladiator who fought the netman. His torso was encased in a linen and leather subarmalis, over which a slave began to buckle the segmented metal manica on his right arm. Commodus watched the reflection, then waved the slave away with a sharp gesture. He finished the buckles himself. The leather was stiff, the fittings cold. This was the first ritual. The armor went on by his hand alone. Around him, the hypogeum was a controlled chaos. Other gladiators, real ones, were preparing in their own cells. The clatter of armor, the murmur of prayers to Nemesis, the distant oceanic rumble of 50,000 voices filtering down through the wooden arena floor above their heads. They did not look at him. An unspoken rule: to acknowledge the emperor in this place was to break the fragile illusion. Here, he was just another fighter in the shadows. Narcissus stood nearby, arms crossed. The trainer's face was unreadable. He had orchestrated this descent layer by layer, but the final step was beyond his control. Commodus picked up his helmet, the smooth, rounded helm of the secutor with its 2 small eye holes. He did not put it on. Instead, he turned from the mirror and walked to the heavy iron gate that led to the arena ramp. He placed a bare hand on the cold metal. Through the grate, he could see a sliver of blinding white sand and the bottom tiers of the cavea, a mosaic of colored tunics and expectant faces. He leaned close to the bars. His voice, when it came, was a whisper. Not for the crowd, but for the only witness he acknowledged in that moment. "Father," he breathed, though Marcus Aurelius had been dead for a year. Then, to the god whose lion skin he would later wear, "Hercules, I will fight 1,000 times." Think about that promise. 1,000 combats. It wasn't a boast. It was a private, impossible oath, the kind you make to yourself in a mirror before stepping into a spotlight you can never leave. It was the math of madness. 735 matches stood between that whisper and the stranglehold in a bath. A horn blast echoed through the tunnels, sharp and metallic. The signal, the gate before him, began to rise with a shuddering groan of chains and counterweights. The slice of sand widened into a glaring rectangle of light, and then the sound hit him. It was a physical wall. The roar of 50,000 Romans, not for the empire but for the spectacle. It was a single deafening exhalation of pure, bloodthirsty noise. It washed over him, through him, vibrating in his chest and drowning the last whispers of the Senate, the petitions, the weight of the purple. In that roar, there was only one truth. He hefted his shield, slid the helmet over his head, and the world narrowed to 2 small circles of light. He stepped forward from the cold dark into the screaming sun. The first of 1,000 gates had opened. A year later, the gold arrived, not in ledgers or promises, but in a physical, breath-stealing mass. It was late in the palace, the halls silent but for the shuffle of the treasury slaves. Commodus stood in the vault, still wearing the sandals caked with arena dust. Before him, stacked on a marble table, was a mountain of freshly minted aurae, 1,000,000 sesterces, his payment from the game's sponsor, himself, for his first 100 victories. He ignored the scrolls piled on a nearby desk. Provincial reports, grain requisitions, a petition from a senator waiting for 3 hours in an antechamber. His fingers, calloused from the sword grip, ran through the coins. They were cool, heavy, perfectly stamped with his own profile. This was the sound of applause made solid. When a side hustle becomes more rewarding and more all-consuming than your actual job, the state documents start to look like ash. Narcissus watched from the doorway. The trainer's silence had deepened over the months into something wary. He saw the emperor not counting wealth but counting fights. Each coin was a man faced, a gate walked through, a roar absorbed. Commodus scooped a handful and let them cascade back into the pile. The metallic clatter was the only music he cared to hear. "It's not enough," Commodus said, "not to Narcissus, but to the gold." The senator outside, a man named Falco, finally dared to clear his throat. The scroll in his hand detailed a border skirmish in Britannia that required imperial attention. Commodus didn't turn. He picked up a single aureus, holding it to the lamplight. It gilded his iris. "Melt it down," he commanded. The treasury slaves froze. Narcissus took a half step forward. "Caesar, the coinage." Not the coins. The tribute from Cyprus. The bullion in the West Vault. Commodus finally looked at his trainer, and his eyes were those of the secutor in the helmet, distant, focused on a singular, brutal point. "All of it. I want it rendered and hammered. Gild my manica, my greaves, my helmet. Let them see the sun on me from the very back row." It was an order that bankrupted dignity. The state treasury, the muscle of Rome, was to be converted into stage glitter for a single performer. Falco, the forgotten senator, slowly lowered his scroll. He understood now. The petitions, the borders, the empire itself had become a tedious backdrop to the emperor's private drama. As the slaves began hauling the bullion away, Falco turned and walked silently down the corridor. He would not return with another scroll. He would return much later with a conspiracy. Commodus remained, a silhouette against the dwindling horde. He was building a new currency, one measured in roars and paid for in solid gold. The path from that vault led only one way, deeper into the glare, where a man could no longer tell the difference between an emperor and his own gilded reflection. The Senate House, 185 AD. The air was stale with old marble and older men. They sat in silence, not of respect, but of suspended breath. The doors swung open. Commodus entered, but not in the purple of an emperor. He wore the pelt of a Nubian lion, its head snarling over his own, the claws knotted on his chest. Hercules walking among mortals. He did not take the curule chair. He stood before them. The arena sand still gritted under his sandals on the polished floor. His voice, trained to carry over 80,000 throats, required no effort here. "Rome is tired," he announced. "Her name is worn thin by history. I give her a new one. From this day she is Colonia Commodiana, my colony. And her months?" He smiled, a gladiator's grin. "They will bear my 12 gladiatorial names. This one," he pointed at the air, "is Amazonius. The next, Exuperatorius." A dry, ragged cough shattered the silent theater. It came from an old senator in the third row, a man named Pompeianus, whose lungs were simply betraying him. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, every eye wide with terror flicked to him, then back to the emperor. Commodus stopped. He turned his head slowly, the lion's glass eyes seeming to stare with him. He said nothing. He just watched as the old man pressed a fist to his mouth, his shoulders shaking, the coughs dying into a desperate, wheezing silence. The emperor held his gaze for 10 full seconds after the last sound faded. The message was not in a threat, but in the watching, the point where eccentricity crosses a line and becomes a threat everyone can see but no one dares name. The session ended without further discussion. That night, a fire began in the kitchen of Senator Pompeianus's home on the Aventine Hill. It spread with a hungry, peculiar speed. The old man and his entire household were ash by dawn. The urban cohorts reported faulty wiring. No one asked about the smell of lamp oil in the rubble. Commodus, they said, was dining with his favorite charioteer when the news came. He merely nodded, as if confirming a minor appointment. The renaming would proceed. The line was now a border, and he had just shown everyone what lay across it. The Colosseum at noon, December 192 AD. The winter sun was a cold white coin in a hard blue sky, casting sharp, short shadows on the sand. Commodus faced his 735th opponent. His name was Priscus, a retiarius from Gaul, armed with trident and net. The emperor was secutor, the pursuer, his helmet smooth and close-fitted, a short sword in his hand. The crowd of 80,000 was not silent in awe, but in a dull, heavy quiet. They had seen this too many times. Commodus moved with an economical, bored grace. Priscus cast his net. The emperor sidestepped, not with the frantic energy of the arena, but with the mild irritation of a man brushing away a fly. He knocked the trident aside with his shield. The clash of iron on bronze was a flat, lonely sound in the vast silence. This was not a fight. It was a demonstration of ownership. He owned the sand, the silence, and the man across from him. He disarmed the Gaul not with a fierce strike, but with a precise, contemptuous flick of his blade. The trident spun into the dust. Priscus stumbled back, his net useless, his hands empty. Commodus did not press the kill. He pointed his sword tip at the sand and made a slow, circular motion. The command was clear: crawl. Priscus hesitated, his chest heaving. Then he sank to his knees. The emperor watched, his head tilted, as the gladiator began to shuffle forward on all fours. The sound was the scrape of leather and flesh on grit, the pant of exhausted breath. Commodus turned his back on him, a gesture of supreme arrogance, and walked 10 paces toward the senatorial box. He stopped. He lifted his blood-streaked sword in a theatrical salute, his eyes scanning the rows of white-robed men. He was not looking for cheers. He was demanding validation. The senators stared back. Their faces were not masks of hatred, nor of fear in that moment. They were stone, blank, impassive, closed, a wall of silent judgment. Here was the Emperor of Rome, performing for an audience that had stopped being an audience and started being witnesses. The only movement was a slight, cold breeze ruffling the fringe of a toga. The emperor's smile beneath his helmet rim froze, then faded. The rejection was absolute, and it was public. He turned back to the arena, his playfulness gone. Priscus had managed to stand, swaying, his hands raised in empty surrender. Commodus walked toward him, not with a charge, but with a grim, businesslike stride. He did not aim for the heart. He drove his blade in a shallow, brutal thrust up under the ribs, a kill designed for prolonged agony. Priscus folded over the sword with a wet gasp, then collapsed. The silence held for 3 more heartbeats. Then, from the upper tiers, a few scattered claps began, brittle and forced, spreading like a nervous infection through the crowd. It was not applause. It was the sound of people remembering the consequences of quiet. Commodus yanked his blade free. He did not acknowledge the stands. He looked down at the body, then at his own gilded hand, as if puzzled by the lack of something. The thrill was gone. Only the number remained, and the next empty gate waiting to open. As he strode toward the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of death, the scattered claps died away, leaving only the whisper of 80,000 people shifting in their seats, and the first flies descending to the new red stain on the sand. He returned to the palace, not as an emperor, but as a performer after a bad show. The vulnerable, quiet moment when you think the curtain is closed and you're finally alone. The baths were empty, steam rising from the hot pool in the lamplight. The water was scented with rose oil, a cloying sweetness that couldn't mask the iron smell still on his skin. Commodus sank into the heat, his hands resting on the marble edge. They were a map of his obsession, old hard calluses from the sword grip, fresh cuts across the knuckles from that afternoon. He stared at the statue of Hercules in the corner, its marble face stern in the shifting vapor. "Ungrateful," he muttered to it. "After all, I give them bread? I give them spectacle. I give them myself." He didn't see the bath attendant, a silent figure blending with the shadows by the linen racks. The man watched the emperor talk to the stone god, his words slurring with wine and exhaustion. He saw the moment Commodus's head tilted back against the marble, eyes closing, the tension finally seeping out in the steam. The attendant did not move until the emperor's breathing deepened. Then he slipped from the room, a ghost in the humid air. His message was already formed, a single line to be carried to a certain house on the Aventine Hill. He is in the bath. He is alone, the conspiracy patient for years had its opening. The message reached the house on the Aventine within the hour. From there it traveled up the hill to a finer villa on the Palatine, its white walls catching the moonlight. 5 men were already waiting in a study at the back, away from the street. The room was small, lit by a single oil lamp that threw their shadows, huge and wavering, against the frescoed walls. There was no feast, no ceremony, just a clay jug of wine, watered almost to transparency, and 5 cups. The host was a senator whose name does not survive. The guests did. The Praetorian prefect, Quintus Aemilius Latus, his face all hard lines and military patience, the imperial chamberlain, Eclectus, who knew every corridor and whisper in the palace, 2 other senators, their rings gleaming dully in the low light. A scroll lay open on the small marble table between them. It was a list, copied from the Ludus Magnus master rolls, the emperor's gladiatorial aliases, all 12 of them: Hercules Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Laetus. His finger, calloused from a sword grip of his own, tapped one name near the bottom: Pagnarius, the playful one, the jester. "He has booked the New Year games," Laetus said, his voice low and flat. 30 days of spectacle. He intends to fight every afternoon in every style on this list. He will rename the city from the sand, and the Senate. He looked at the 2 senators. "You will be made to kneel in the arena and swear oaths to him as Hercules reborn." One of the senators, an old man with veins like marble cracks on his hands, spoke. "The people are weary. The legions murmur. The treasury is a joke. But this final vanity," he shook his head, "the quiet meeting where a line is crossed from complaint to conspiracy, it is never a shout, it is a sigh." "We end this," Laetus said, "before the new year, before he can make his farce permanent." The method was the question. Not a public coup too messy, too likely to spark a war. Not poison in his wine. His food tasters were numerous, and he was paranoid. Eclectus, the chamberlain, leaned forward. He is most vulnerable in the ritual. The bath after the games. He dismisses the guards for privacy. He is exhausted, his senses dulled by the steam and the wine. They agreed on the place. The palace baths, the time, the very room where he now slept unsuspecting. Then came the final practical point. The hand Commodus was, despite everything, phenomenally strong. A man who had fought 735 times, who trained daily with Narcissus. It would require a specific kind of strength to overpower him quickly, silently, in the wet confines of a bathhouse. Laetus provided the name. The one man whose presence would not alarm the emperor, whose strength was beyond question, and whose access was total. "Narcissus," he said, "the trainer from Alexandria, the man who had taught the emperor how to kill." The irony was not lost on them. It was perfect. The lamp flickered. The conspiracy, now a plan, had its instrument. The summons reached Narcissus before dawn. A single, unmarked slave met him at the gate of his own modest home, spoke a password from the Palatine Hill meeting, and vanished. No explanation was needed. The trainer knew why they had come for him, and he knew what they would ask. He had seen the deadness in the Senate's eyes at the last games. He had felt the empire's foundation, like sand, shifting under their feet. For an hour, he sat in the dark of his courtyard, the coiled leather cord they had sent him resting in his broad, scarred palm. It was oiled, supple, and terribly strong. When the first gray light touched the roof tiles, he stood. He had made his decision not out of loyalty to the plotters, but out of loyalty to the thing Rome was supposed to be, a thing Commodus had long since drowned in blood and vanity. The walk through the empty palace was a procession of ghosts. His sandals echoed on marble floors, still shadowed and cold, past silent halls where statues of better emperors watched with blank stone eyes. He passed a grand mural, freshly painted, Commodus as Hercules, his muscles gleaming, strangling the Nemean lion. The face was a perfect, flattering likeness. Narcissus remembered teaching that boy how to grip, how to use his weight, how to leverage a neck. The lesson had been for the wrestling sand, not for a fresco. He did not pause. He knew the route to the baths by heart, having taken it with the emperor 1,000 times after training. The palaestra was empty, the exercise balls and weights lying still. The air grew warmer, thicker with the scent of heated stone and mineral water. He passed through the tepidarium, its pool shimmering in the lamplight, and approached the archway leading to the caldarium, the hottest room. Steam, visible and curling, drifted from the doorway like breath. This was the moment every assassin knows, though few have ever killed an emperor. That final, suspended second before the act. The point of no return is not the strike itself, but the last step you take while still an innocent man, walking to do something you know will change everything, with the tools already in your hand. He could hear the soft, rhythmic slosh of water from within. Commodus was in there, alone, steam-dazed and weary from the previous day's butchery, believing himself safe in the one ritual he controlled. Narcissus felt the cord in his hand, a simple loop of death. He thought of the oath he had heard the young emperor whisper years before, to fight 1,000 times. That boy was gone. What remained in that bath was a monster of his own making. The trainer took a final deep breath. It did not steady his hands. Then he stepped through the curtain of steam, from the world of what might be into the world of what must be. The steam parted. The caldarium was a cavern of heat and haze. Light from high, narrow windows cut through the vapor in solid beams, illuminating swirling clouds that obscured the painted ceiling. The air was thick, wet, and smelled of rose oil, heated marble, and the faint metallic scent of the mineral spring feeding the pool. In the center of the room, sunk into the floor, was the bath itself, a rectangle of near scalding water, and in it, up to his chest, was Commodus. His head was tilted back against the marble rim, eyes closed. His arms rested on the ledge, the old knotted calluses of his palms facing upward, pale and wrinkled from the water. The scars from a decade of training and 735 fights mapped his skin, a white line across a forearm from a mistimed parry, the knot of a broken rib long healed, the shiny patch on a shoulder where a trident had once gouged. He looked for the first time in years like what he was, a tired man, not a god. Narcissus moved silently on the wet mosaic floor. His shadow passed over the emperor's face. "Dominus," he said, his voice the same low, steady tone he'd used for 12 years of instruction. Commodus's eyes opened, slow and heavy. He saw his trainer, and a faint, relaxed smile touched his lips. "Narcissus, is it time already?" "The New Year games approach," Narcissus said, kneeling by the bath's edge as if to check the water's heat. He kept his hands below the rim, out of sight. "Your form was off yesterday with the secular shield, your left foot drifts. We should correct it before the procession." Commodus sighed, a contented sound lost in the steam. Always the teacher, even here. He flexed his hand, watching the water drip from his fingers. 735, the 1,000 grows closer. Narcissus did not answer. His right hand, below the marble, worked one end of the oiled leather cord into a slipknot. His mind was perfectly, terribly clear. He saw not the emperor, but the boy swinging a wooden sword at a post, his hands raw and bleeding. He heard the oath whisper to Hercules, "I will fight 1,000 times." This was the ultimate betrayal, the person who taught you everything, ending everything. "We will begin with the footwork at dawn," Narcissus said, his voice still soft. He leaned forward as if to emphasize a point. His left hand shot out and clamped over the emperor's forehead, yanking his head back against the bath's rim. At the same instant, his right hand looped the cord around the exposed throat and crossed the ends. The movement was the same brutal, efficient motion he'd used 1,000 times to demonstrate a chokehold on the training sand. Commodus's eyes flew wide, not with fear, but with pure, incredulous shock. His hands, those weapons that had killed hundreds, slapped at the water, then scrabbled at the leather, biting into his neck. His legs kicked violently, churning the bath into a frothing chaos. A wet, strangled gasp escaped him, more a question than a scream. Narcissus braced his knee against the marble, his own face a mask of strain, and pulled. He put his entire weight, every lesson of leverage he had ever taught, into the twist. The struggle was short, violent, and almost silent, muffled by water and steam. The emperor's thrashing weakened, became spasms. His hands stilled, floated to the surface. Then it was still the water, settled. The steam, churned by the struggle, began to thin. The only sound was the steady drip of water from a bronze lion-headed spout into the pool. Narcissus released the cord. He did not look at the face. He stood, his own breath ragged, and walked out of the caldarium. He left the door open behind him. The cold air from the corridor rushed in, meeting the wet heat, and the last of the steam dissolved. An hour later, the bath chamber was a different place. The light from the high windows was clear and cold, falling in sharp rectangles on the mosaic floor. The scent of rose oil had vanished, replaced by the flat, metallic smell of mineral water and something else, coppery and faint. Commodus's body lay half submerged, turned slightly, one arm draped over the marble edge as if resting. The water around him was perfectly still. The leather cord, dark and slick, floated nearby like a dead serpent. He had fought 735 times in the sand. He had faced retiari with nets, secators with short swords, and bears from Germania. He had walked away from every one, his hand raised, his treasury heavier. The 736th fight killed him, and it wasn't in the arena. It was here, in the silence, at the hands of the man who taught him how to stand. The oath was dead. The vow to Hercules, whispered before an iron gate over a decade before. "I will fight 1,000 times," died with him in the water. 265 matches short, the grand project of his life, the only one that ever truly mattered to him, was left unfinished on the ledger. No fanfare, no crowd, just the drip of the spout counting the seconds in the empty room. Outside, Rome slept, unaware. The stage for the New Year's Games was being built in the Forum. The lions were in their cages. The senators, those who knew, waited in their homes, listening to the silence of the night, wondering if the weight had lifted. They would find out at dawn. The Praetorian prefect Latus had his story ready: a sudden fit, a choking seizure in the bath. The chamberlain Eclectus had the succession documents prepared. The conspiracy was clean, surgical. It left no visible wound. But in that quiet chamber, the cost was visible. It was in the calloused hand, open and empty, that had held a scepter and a sword with equal ease. It was in the stillness of a man who could never be still. The stark, quiet aftermath of chaos, the grand plan unfinished, the stage empty. This was the final victory, and it belonged to no one. The empire would turn without him. The water would grow cold. And the only witness was the statue of Hercules in the corner, its stone eyes staring at the floating cord, and the emperor who had played at being a god and had died like a man. 1 week later, the Senate met in the Curia Julia under a gray winter sky. The new emperor, Pertinax, a stern former general with the posture of a spear, addressed them. His voice carried no poetry, no divine pretension. He spoke of fiscal responsibility, of restoring the grain dole, of repairing the roads. Then he gestured to a scroll held by a quaestor. The previous emperor's theatrical equipment, he said, the pause deliberate. His gilded weapons, his gem-encrusted shields, the lion-skin cloaks, they will be sold at public auction. The proceeds will refill the aerarium. The treasury was empty. The imperial vaults held a fortune in stage props and a mountain of debt. How quickly the world moves to erase someone, selling off the relics of their obsession. Across the forum, at the base of the Colosseum's outer wall, a different erasure was underway. A workman on a wooden scaffold, his breath fogging in the cold air, worked a chisel and hammer. Tap, 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 tap. He was carefully removing a name from a dedication inscription. The stone dust, fine and white, drifted down from the second course of travertine blocks. It fell in a gentle shower onto the sandy floor of the arena entrance below, the very spot where 7 days prior, Commodus had walked out for his 735th match. The name being excised was Commodi. The work was slow, methodical. The empire was already chiseling him out of its skin. Back in the Senate, Pertinax finished speaking. The silence that followed was not the terrified hush of the previous reign, but the quiet of calculation. Men were already thinking of the auction, of who might buy a piece of the dead god's costume, of how to turn spectacle back into coin. No one mentioned the bath. No one spoke of Narcissus, who had already vanished from the city. The official story, a sudden seizure, was accepted without a single dissenting voice. The conspiracy had been so clean it left no fingerprints, only a convenient corpse and a manageable truth. The workman's chisel found an edge and pried. A large flake of stone bearing the final eye cracked loose and tumbled down. It shattered on the packed earth with a dry, final sound. The dust settled on the sand. In that arena, he had been Hercules, Amazonius exuperatorius. He had commanded the thunder of applause. Now, his name was just debris to be swept away with the afternoon's refuse. The story they told themselves and would tell for centuries was about a mad god-king who defiled the purple. The truth, lying cold in a drained bath, was simpler and more human. It was about a boy who stood before a gate and made an oath to a statue. It was about a man who got lost inside the reflection of his own legend, who confused the echo of the crowd for the voice of history, and who in the end was removed from the record as quietly as a misspelled word. Rome had endured the performance now. It was selling the costume.